The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom crashed open with a resounding thud that echoed through the high-ceilinged chamber. Caroline Leavitt stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was young, barely into her 30s, but her presence filled the room like a seasoned veteran. In her hands, she clutched a thick manila folder stuffed with documents, the edges worn from hours of preparation. Every eye in the room turned to her, from the jurors in their box to the reporters lining the back wall. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the entire space knew something explosive was about to unfold. At the bench loomed Judge Howard Gates, a towering figure in both stature and reputation. His gray hair was neatly combed, his black robe impeccable, but his sharp, hawk-like eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as Caroline approached. Gates was a man who ruled his courtroom with an iron fist, his biting sarcasm and unpredictable rulings the stuff of legend among lawyers. But today, something was off. Caroline could see it, the way his fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his glasses, the faint tightening of his jaw. He was nervous, and she intended to find out why. She reached the plaintiff's table and dropped her file onto it with a deliberate heavy thud. Papers rustled, a pen rolled to the edge and stopped. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "Charles Lawson stands accused of siphoning state funds into his private development projects. The evidence is right here, undeniable and ready to be heard." Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. A smirk tugged at the corner of his thin lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, drawing out her name with a mocking lilt, "I do hope this isn't another one of your grand performances designed to waste my time. You know how I feel about dull stories cluttering up my docket." A few chuckles rippled from the defense table, where Lawson's team of slick-suited attorneys sat. Caroline didn't even glance their way. She'd faced worse than courtroom snickers in her career. "This is a multi-million-dollar corruption case," she replied, her tone steady and unyielding. "And I'm certain you're well aware of that, Your Honor." The smirk vanished from Gates's face. His fingers tapped the bench once, twice, then stopped, a sharp, staccato rhythm that betrayed his irritation. "Watch your tone, Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening growl. "You're treading on thin ice." Caroline lifted her file, holding it up like a weapon. "You should watch yours," she said coolly. "These documents are about to do a lot of talking." A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging quick, uncertain glances. Reporters at the back scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against notepads. Gates squirmed in his high-backed chair, his fingers fumbling with his tie for a moment before he caught himself and stilled. Caroline moved with purpose, stepping to the projector and flicking it on. A table of figures illuminated the screen, columns of numbers, dates, and account transfers, all stark and damning. "Lawson's company," she said, pointing to the screen with a steady hand, "received triple the approved budget for their latest project. $12 million, to be exact. That money flowed into their accounts, yet there's no trace of it in the state's financial records. Care to explain why, Your Honor?" Gates cut her off before she could finish, his voice slicing through the room like a whip. "Enough," he barked. "These numbers prove nothing. I've seen better spreadsheets from first-year law students. Wrap up this little show. Ms. Leavitt Caroline didn't budge. She turned slightly, gesturing to the screen again. They prove plenty, she said, her voice rising just enough to carry over his interruption. If that money ended up in your pocket. The courtroom went silent. So silent you could hear the faint hum of the projector. Gates's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. He slammed his fist onto the bench, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The water glass beside him wobbled precariously. "Are you accusing me?" he roared, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Caroline remained calm, almost eerily so. She set the stack of papers back on the table with a soft thud and clasped her hands in front of her. "Not me, Your Honor," she said, her tone measured and deliberate. "The evidence!" Gates's face contorted with rage. "This is absolute nonsense," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. But there was a crack in it, a faint, trembling edge that Caroline latched onto immediately. The judge wasn't just angry. He was scared. And that fear was the key she'd been waiting for. Caroline didn't let the moment slip. She turned to the bailiff. "Call the witness," she said, her voice firm. The side doors creaked open, and a woman shuffled in. Susan Miller, Lawson's former accountant. She was in her late 40s, her brown hair pulled back tightly, her hands trembling as she clutched a small purse. She stepped up to the witness stand, swore the oath, and sat, her eyes darting nervously between Caroline and the bench. Caroline approached her, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Ms. Miller," she began, "what can you tell us about Mr. Lawson and Judge Gates?" Susan swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. She glanced at Gates, then quickly away. They met regularly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In private. Lawson and Gates. There were payments arranged, not for the projects, but for personal accounts. I saw the transfers myself." The courtroom erupted. Murmurs turned into gasps, then into a low roar of disbelief. A juror dropped his pen, the clatter loud in the chaos. Gates shot to his feet, his robe billowing as he pounded the bench with both fists. "Lies!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "This witness is bought. She's unreliable. I demand she be dismissed." Caroline pivoted to face him, unflinching. "Then prove it in cross-examination," she said, her voice cutting through his outburst. "But right now, she has the right to speak." Gates's eyes burned with hatred. "I run this courtroom," he bellowed, leaning forward so far he nearly toppled over the bench. Caroline stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. "But you don't run justice," she said, each word landing like a hammer. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Gates's chest heaved, his fists clenched. Then his control snapped. "Are you trying to take me down?" he roared, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and desperation. Caroline lifted the documents again, holding them like a shield. "The truth will do that for me," she said. Before Gates could respond, the main doors swung open with a bang. Two uniformed officers strode in, their boots thudding against the floor. The taller one held a folded warrant in his hand, his face stern and unreadable. He stopped at the edge of the bench and raised his voice. "Howard Gates," he said, his tone cold and official. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." The courtroom froze. Time seemed to stop. Gates sank back into his chair, his mouth falling open in disbelief. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice so faint it barely carried. The officers moved around the bench, one pulling out a pair of gleaming handcuffs. They grabbed his arms, yanking him to his feet. Caroline watched, her expression unreadable. "They can," she said simply. Gates thrashed against them, his robe tangling around his legs. "I am the law here," he screamed, his voice rising to a frantic pitch as he fought their grip. Caroline met his wild eyes, her own steady and cold. "Not any more." The cuffs snapped shut with a sharp, metallic click. Gates's shoulders slumped, his face draining of color. He twisted his head, scanning the room. Jurors, reporters, Lawson's team, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene. But no one moved. The silence was deafening. The officers hauled Gates toward the side exit, his feet dragging against the floor. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters leapt from their seats, shouting questions and scribbling notes with frantic speed. Their pens raced across pages, ink smudging in their haste. Jurors whispered to each other, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. One man rubbed his forehead as if trying to process what he'd just seen. At the defense table, Charles Lawson sat motionless, his face as pale as chalk. His hands gripped the table's edge so tightly, his knuckles turned white, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His eyes followed Gates, wide and unblinking, as the judge disappeared through the door. Gates made one last attempt as he reached the exit. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted, his voice hoarse and breaking. "You'll all see the truth." But the words fell flat, empty of conviction. No one believed him anymore. Caroline turned to Lawson, her posture calm but commanding. "Your turn, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice low and deliberate, carrying an edge of steel. Lawson jolted upright, his chair screeching against the floor. "Wait! Wait!" he cried, his voice cracking with panic. He stumbled forward, nearly tripping over his own feet. "I'll talk! I'll tell you everything!" Caroline raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly. "How much?" she asked, her tone cool and probing. Lawson's eyes darted around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. "All of it," he said, his voice trembling. "Everything I know. But I want protection, full immunity." Caroline nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then you'd better start." "Talking," she said. The side door slammed shut behind Gates, the sound echoing through the room like a final gavel strike. For a moment, the courtroom fell into an eerie stillness, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a thick fog. Then the noise returned, murmurs, rustling papers, the clatter of a reporter's dropped phone. Caroline gathered her documents, stacking them neatly on the table before taking her seat. The case wasn't over. Lawson still had to face the music, and the trial would continue. But the biggest hurdle, the towering figure of Judge Howard Gates, was gone, dragged out in handcuffs in front of the very people he'd ruled over for years. She leaned toward her team, keeping her voice low. "We're not done," she said. "We'll submit more evidence tomorrow. This corruption runs deeper than Gates. He was just the tip of the iceberg." Lawson slumped back into his chair, his shoulders hunched. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered, but the words lacked fire, barely audible over the hum of the room. Caroline glanced at him, her gaze piercing. "No," she said firmly, "it's justice." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a dark cloud had been swept away. For years, Gates had sat at that bench, wielding power like a king. Now the throne was empty, and the balance had tipped. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. Caroline's eyes drifted to the vacant bench. Gates's chair still rocked slightly from his abrupt exit, a silent testament to his fall. But the story didn't end here, not by a long shot. Lawson's confession was coming, and with it, a flood of revelations. What would he say? Who else was tangled in this web of corruption? Politicians, CEOs, maybe even higher judges. Could this single case bring down an entire system built on greed and secrecy? The room buzzed with questions. Jurors leaned forward, whispering to each other in hushed, excited tones. Reporters scrambled to their feet, some already dialing their editors, others sprinting for the doors to file their stories. This wasn't just news. It was history in the making. Caroline packed her bag, sliding the last of her papers inside, but her mind was already racing ahead. She'd cracked the surface, but beneath it lay a labyrinth of lies waiting to be exposed. And you, watching this unfold, don't you want to know what's next? What happens when Lawson spills every dirty detail? Who else falls in the wake of Gates's collapse? This courtroom is a powder keg, and the fuse is still burning. Stick around, because this is only the start.